Now, in 1896, President McKinley is elected, comes to power in March of 1897. And oftentimes people will say he's an imperialist, he wanted to, grab countries. That is absolutely wrong in describing President McKinley. He is not an imperialist. There are people in the Republican Party who are, okay? People like Teddy Roosevelt are a little more like that, okay? McKinley is not that guy. He is for a greater role of the United States in the world, but he is not an imperialist. So, for instance, on the issue of Hawaii, he wants to continue what Grover Cleveland's doing. He does not want to take over Hawaiian Islands. He wants to ensure nobody else takes it. So we have to have some control over that port, but we don't need to own those islands. He has no interest in bringing Hawaii into the United States. He does want to buy some islands in the West Indies. Now, the West Indies are these small islands kind of southeast from Puerto Rico. And he wants to buy some of those islands. Now, why would he want to buy those islands? Any ideas on that? Why would he want to buy those islands? What's the purpose of islands? Bases, coaling stations for the Navy, right? We need some places, if we're going to have a more expanded role in the Americas, and if we're going to keep the colonial powers out of the Americas, we need Navy bases where we can put some coal in that region, okay? So he wants to buy some islands in the West Indies from Denmark. Denmark owns a bunch of islands down there, and we want to buy them. Now, he never does buy them. We don't buy them for about 20 years, but eventually we do get those islands sort of after World War I. Any ideas what those islands are today? Because they're still part of the United States. Any ideas what they are? It's the U.S. Virgin Islands. So if you've ever heard of those set of islands, a small cluster of islands, we bought them from Denmark around World War I. So he wanted to do that. He just never does do that. And again, is that colonialism? That's kind of questionable. It would depend on how they come in and all those sorts of things. And he absolutely wants a canal. And we talked about that last class, the strategic importance of a canal between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Because without a canal, our Navy has to sail all the way around South America. And again, we don't have to own it, but we do have to have control over that canal. And so he is an expansionist, but he is not an imperialist. He's not a guy who just wants to go out there grabbing land. And the Republican Party platform that year said, we want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression. So even the Republican Party is not an imperialist party. There are really no Americans who want to go out taking land. And yet, within 2 years, we are going to be in a colonial power, okay? War changes you, and it changes a country, and that is what is going to happen here. The night before he took the oath of office, McKinley went up to meet with the president, President Cleveland, at the White House, and they discussed current events and what was going on in the future. And among the things McKinley said was, I shall be the happiest man in the world to avoid war over Cuba. Because remember, these tensions had been boiling for a number of years at this point, and he did not want to get involved in it. He wanted to try to avoid war in Cuba. Now, as soon as he takes office, he begins negotiating with Spain over the issue of Cuba. Spain had been carrying out a very harsh war in Cuba. Lots of humanitarian crises down there. People were killed in large numbers. And so again, it was a very important topic to the American people. And so he began negotiations as soon as he took office to try to solve the issue down there in Cuba. And so he conducted these negotiations, and by the fall, they had essentially solved the problem. They had reached a diplomatic agreement to resolve the crisis down there in Cuba. And eventually, what it called for was Spain was going to begin to give Cuba greater control over its destiny, begin to pull out of there. It was going to be a process, right? It's not going to happen overnight, but Spain had agreed to this, and we were on that path by the fall of 1897. Now, as part of the agreement, we completed a deal where Spain would send some Navy ships to New York on a visit, so sort of a friendly visit to New York. And in return, the U.S. would send some Navy ships down to Havana Harbor in Cuba. So he orders the USS Maine down to Havana. The USS Maine is there for a couple of reasons. Number one, as part of this bigger agreement to solve the issues of Cuba, but also to be there just in case, because there's still a war going on and there are Americans who might get caught up in it, and so we want a Navy ship nearby if they need help escaping or whatever. And so the USS Maine is sent down to Havana for that reason. Now, in the midst of all of this, the Maine arrives in Havana on January 25th. It explodes on February 15th. But in between those two events, one of those tabloid journals I talked about, the New York Journal, published an intercepted letter between the minister from Spain to the United States, so essentially the ambassador. So the ambassador to the United States back to the Spanish government. So this is a letter the ambassador is sending describing the political situation in Washington, D.C. This was published in a New York newspaper. And you see the quote here, McKinley is weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crowd. Besides being a would-be politician who tries to leave a door open behind himself while keeping on good terms with the Jongees of his party. Now, Jongees refers to the more imperialist or colonialist sort of expansionist Republicans. So those people like Teddy Roosevelt in the Republican Party. Now, we don't like it when somebody else talks bad about our president. We can talk bad about our president all day long, but we don't like it when foreigners do that. But if it wasn't for the explosion the next week, nobody would remember this thing. I mean, look, that's really not too harsh of a statement about McKinley. Essentially, what is the ambassador saying? He's a politician. Politicians are always looking for two sides of the same issue, right? Trying not to anger their political constituency. He's describing a politician, is really all he's describing. But when it was published in February, it kind of makes people a little angry because the Spanish are talking bad about our president. Not a big deal. It only becomes a big deal because of the explosion a week later. Without the explosion, we would have all forgotten about this, wouldn't mean anything. So this does not get us into the war. But when the explosion happens, it gives you one more reason to hate the Spanish. Everybody see that? So again, the yellow journalists don't get us into the war, but they can heighten a little bit that tension. And that's essentially the effect of the Delaunay letter. Now, Teddy Roosevelt had this to say about McKinley. White-livered McKinley has no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. It's probably my favorite quote in the world. So he can talk bad about our president, but we don't want the Spanish people talking bad about our president. at this point, we talked about Teddy Roosevelt. He is a rising star. We got the history of him up there. When McKinley becomes president, he is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Okay? What does the Assistant Secretary of the Navy do? What do you think his job is? Well, he probably has a lot of jobs, but one of his big jobs is to take control of the Navy if the Secretary of the Navy is not there. So in the absence of the Secretary of the Navy, he's the Secretary of the Navy. Now, the important thing for our story is this. At the time of this crisis, the Secretary of the Navy was gone most of the time. He was either on vacation or he was out sick. And so who does that mean is in charge of the U.S. Navy? At the time of this crisis, it means Teddy Roosevelt is in charge. And we talked about Teddy Roosevelt is a hard-charging guy. He is a willful man. He's going to do what he thinks is right, and he ain't going to wait for orders. He's not going to wait for the president to tell him what to do. He's just going to make decisions. And so at the time of this crisis, he's the guy making all the decisions for the Navy. All right? And that's sort of important to understand. In the aftermath of this war, as soon as the war breaks out, he's going to resign that job. He's going to join the Army. He's going to fight down in Cuba. He's going to become a national hero. As a result of that, he's going to become governor of New York. As a result of that, we'll talk about why in a moment, he's going to become vice president of the United States. And by September of 1901, he is the president of the United States, the youngest president ever. He is like on a rocket ship to the moon. I mean, it is an amazing career that this guy has. And as I've said all along, he's involved in everything that happens during this period of American history. Okay? So, the explosion of the Maine. It had sailed into the harbor. Remember, it's there on sort of a dual purpose, show of friendship, but also to show the flag and be there to protect Americans should they need protection. And one night, it explodes and 250 something people are killed. U.S. sailors are killed. Now, here's the thing. The American people believe it was an external explosion. Now, if it's an external explosion, who's at fault? Who caused it? If it's an external explosion that sinks this ship. The Spanish are at fault. And if the Spanish caused this, what do you have to do? The Spanish have just dastardly blown up a U.S. Navy ship at harbor, killing 250-something sailors. What do you have to do? You got to get back in them. You got to go to war. You have to force them to pay, whatever. They're going to have to pay for this if they caused it, okay? It's important to understand, because again, people will say it was the yellow journalists that heightened this crisis and caused us to go to the war. That is absolutely false. I'll tell you, I've spent a lot of time researching this period for Texas history specifically, and everybody believed this. All the newspapers believed it was an outside attack, that the explosion had come from the outside, and if it came from the outside, it was the Spanish. And if the Spanish did this, it means war. That's what the American people believe. It's not just the yellow journals. Now, they might heighten it a little bit, but everybody believes this. And if you believe it, you have no choice but to go to war. Okay? So sometimes it's not important what really happens. What's really important is what people think happens. And that's the case here. The American people think it was an external explosion. Now, the Spanish deny that. They say, no, it was an internal explosion. Now, President McKinley absolutely wants to avoid war. He had been a general in the Civil War. He knew what war was like. He didn't want a war. He wanted to avoid it, even after this explosion. And so he says, look, we got to let things calm down. And so I'm going to have an investigation go on to see what happens. That'll take weeks. And by the time the investigation comes back, maybe the passions will have cooled down and we can avoid a war, because we've already solved the problem with Cuba. Remember that. Before this explosion, we had solved Cuba. It was going to play out over the next couple months, but it was solved. And he did not want to go to war. So he sends some investigators down to try to ascertain what happened. The Spanish do the same thing. And in April, they both issue reports. The Spanish say it was an internal explosion. The Americans say it was an external explosion. Now, who are the American people going to believe? The Spanish or the Americans? They're going to believe the Americans. And as a result of that, the political pressure then is too great. And eventually, McKinley is going to have to. He's politically forced into going to war. He doesn't want to, but he's sort of cornered. He's got no choice but to go to war because the American people are demanding this. Now, here's a picture from that investigation. You see the ship sunk here. So what really happened? Well, we still don't know exactly. But in the 1960s, I think it was, they went back and reinvestigated this. And this is what they think happened. What is the power source for the USS Maine? How is it powered? It's a coal-fired steamship, okay? Now, where do you put the coal on a big battleship? You put it in a giant room about the size of your house. It's kind of at the bottom, but you put it in a giant room, okay? Now, if you use up all that coal, what's left in the room? What's remaining in the room when you've used up all the coal in that room? Coal dust. And if you light a spark in a room full of coal dust, what's going to happen? An explosion. It works like gunpowder, as Matthew said. It essentially is a bomb. That's what they think happened. We don't know for certain. There's still some question, but we're pretty certain that's what happened. So if it was caused by coal dust, who's at fault? Well, we are, right? By negligence or whatever you want to cause it, say. But certainly the Spanish are not at fault, unless they snuck on there with a cigar and lit it up. But they are not at fault. Doesn't matter. What matters is what people think happened. And what they think happened is it was an external explosion. And so they're going to demand war. Ultimately, McKinley is forced to accept the political realities, and he goes to Congress to request a declaration of war. Now, in that request, he says, in the name of humanity, in the name of civilization, in behalf of endangered American interests, which give us the right and the duty to speak and to act, the war in Cuba must stop. Why are we going to war? Would you say this is for idealism or for realism? Why is McKinley requesting a declaration of war? Is that idealism or realism? These are very idealistic reasons. We're going for humanity. We're going on behalf of civilization, right? McKinley wants to broaden the reason for this war. He doesn't want it to be simply about this action there. It has to be about something bigger. And often presidents will do that. If there's not a clear reason to go to war, say such as the attacks of 2001 or the Japanese attack in 1941, if there's not a clear reason, presidents will often couch them in these idealistic reasons. And that's what McKinley does. And I think he's doing it sincerely because he didn't want to go to war. But if he's going to go to war, he wants it to be about something worthwhile. Now, Congress eventually passes on April 25th the declaration of war, and they attach to it a thing called the Teller Amendment. So this is attached to the declaration of war, and the Teller Amendment says we are not going to war to take Cuba. That's not the purpose of this war. We're not going there for territorial and acquisition of Cuba. That's not it. We're going to war for these idealistic reasons. But here's what I want you to think about. War changes you. It changes you as an individual. It changes you as a nation. Anybody who's been to war can tell you that. You go to war for a certain set of reasons, but the events of that war change you. And you come out the other end a different person or a different country because of what happens in that war. And so we're going to war on behalf of these more idealistic reasons. We had no desire to acquire colonies, and yet we come out of this war a colonial power. So war changes you, and you're going to have to come across these questions in the course of your lifetime as well, and I would urge you to think about that. You may go to war for one reason, but the war is going to change you in ways that you cannot predict. So why do we go to war with Spain? On the one hand, that Cuban revolt, right? And the Spanish were very harsh to the Cuban people. Large numbers of civilians were killed. They rounded them up into what they called reconcentration camps. Diseases wiped out a lot of people. It was very harsh. And the American people saw that humanitarian crisis and wanted to do something. And so that's a factor. Certainly business interests are a factor. There's that ideological connection that these guys are throwing out the last of the colonial powers out of the Americas. And so that's a reason. That Delaunay letter I talked about, it makes you a little more angry. It doesn't send you to war. In fact, none of these get you into a war with Cuba, with Spain over Cuba. None of these. None of these cause you to go to war without that. Without the explosion of the Maine, none of that other stuff matters. And we would have just forgotten it by now. But because of that Maine, because the American people believe they've been attacked, they demand this war. And those other things become the sort of enhancements to the justification. And like I said, the yellow journalism, minor factor. Again, it simply makes you a little more angry. It doesn't cause you to go to war. None of the other things cause a war without the blowing up the Maine. And so without the blowing up of the Maine, there is no war with Spain. We never acquire the Hawaiian Islands, right? Hawaii is probably still an independent country. We never become a colonial power. We never take Puerto Rico, we never take Guam, we never take the Philippines. Without the blowing up of the Maine, we probably never go to war with Japan in 1941. It probably never happens. So this is a very important war. So it's important to understand the causes. The effects of this still are with us today. So war is declared on April 25th. Victory in the Philippines a week later. What the heck are we talking about the Philippines for? What's this war supposed to be about? It's about idealism, and it's about Cuba, right? It's about Cuba. It's not about the Philippines. Why the heck are we in the Philippines? Today, if you go to the Pentagon, they have a war plan for everything, right? They have people who are planning for war with every country in the world, just in case, so that we're ready. I can guarantee you there's a war plan to invade Canada, just in case we ever have to invade Canada. It's because that's what militaries do today. They always plan for any potential situation. Well, that is not the world in 1898. In the 1890s, there was no planning system for war. And so we didn't have a plan for going to war over the issue of Cuba. But in the 1890s, the U.S. Navy had done some thinking about war. You can't really call it planning. You can call it just sitting down and talking about what do we do if we go to war with X country. And so one year, they would write up a set of ideas about what do we do if we go to war with England. And then the next year, they'd write up, what do we do if we go to war with France? And then one year, they wrote up a set of ideas about what do we do if we go to war with Spain. And so they had come up with a couple of ideas about what do we do in the case of war with Spain. And the idea was, number one, we're going to attack the Spanish fleet in Cadiz, which is in Spain, and we're going to attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. It's just a general idea. Now, why would they want to attack those two fleets? They said immediately when war starts, we need to attack those two fleets. Why would they do that? Well, think about the ships of this day, right? They're steamships. Once they leave port, you have no idea where they are. And so the Spanish fleet could leave Cadiz and bombard New York before you know it. And the Spanish fleet could leave the Philippines and bombard San Francisco before you know it. And so you had to attack the fleets before they left port. Well, when the crisis happened in February, who was in charge of the U.S. Navy? It was Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt took that plan off the shelf. Again, it's not really a plan, it's a set of ideas. He takes it off and he looks at it and he says, you know what? It doesn't make any sense to attack Spain because we're going to need that fleet in Cuba for war. Because the war is about Cuba, it's not about Spain. We're going to need a fleet down in Cuba. So he crosses that off the plan. But he says, you know what? The Philippines still makes sense. And so he cables out to the U.S. Admiral out in the Pacific Ocean. He's at Hong Kong and tells them, start getting together a fleet. Start buying coal, start renting ships, start hiring sailors to be prepared in case of war to attack the Philippines. Remember, Teddy's not going to wait for orders. Nobody's telling him to do this. He's just doing it because he thinks it's the right thing to do. And so the U.S. Navy is ready for war when the war kicks off. The U.S. Army is not so ready. And when we declare war, he sends the cable out to Admiral Dewey, attack the Philippines. Now, Admiral Dewey takes his hodgepodge little fleet. They sail out of Hong Kong Harbor, And on the ship of the USS Olympia that I showed you a picture of last class, that tiny little battleship, that's the biggest ship in the fleet, he has the band playing that John Philip Sousa march that I played the other day. So the fleet sails out of Hong Kong. The British general in charge of Hong Kong turns to his friend and says, "Nice bunch of fellas, pity we'll never see them again." And he said that because he assumed, and everybody assumed, this tiny little fleet was going to sail to Manila and be destroyed, right? They were all going to die. That's what everybody assumed. But they sailed into Manila Harbor. They defeated the Spanish fleet on 1 May. And now the president has a problem because the Philippines have fallen into our lap. And it hadn't been thought about. The president didn't have a role in this decision. It was just, that's what the plan said. That's what Teddy did. And as a result of that, we now have to decide what is going to happen to the Philippines in the aftermath of this war. Now, Teddy resigned his position in the U.S. Navy. He joined the Army in a volunteer cavalry unit, usually nicknamed the Rough Riders, and along with the 10th U.S. Cavalry, which was an all-African-American cavalry unit, took part in the big battle in the Cuban campaign. And by July of 1898, the war is essentially over. 5 days later, we annex Hawaii. And Spain signs an armistice a couple weeks later. The war is over within 4 months. It's a tiny little war, and yet it has these huge impacts. Why do we take Hawaii? Because if you're going to be controlling the Philippines, because by this point they'd kind of made the decision, we've got to keep them. If you're going to keep the Philippines, you have to have a secure communication line out there. And so whereas before we could just let the Hawaiian Islands float out there as long as nobody else controlled them, because of this war, remember, war changes you. It changes your interests. And now we have to have those islands. It's not just a nice thing. We have to have them for our own strategic security, because otherwise we might not be able to communicate with the Philippine Islands. So we're going to leave off there. We'll pick up with the actual fighting in Cuba and the decision to keep the Philippine Islands next class. All right? So make sure you log out,